There's a moment in every conflict where the side that believed it held the decisive advantage discovers, not through a diplomatic cable or an intelligence briefing, but through the physical reality of its own destroyed infrastructure, that the advantage it believed it held was a myth constructed from decades of unopposed preparation and never actually tested against the force that had been quietly building the answer to it. For Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that moment arrived not with the thunder of carrier-launched airstrikes or the diplomatic announcement of a new sanctions package. It arrived in silence, in darkness. In the specific silence of coastal launch infrastructure that had been built over 20 years of meticulous engineering and concealment, going permanently offline in the hours before dawn across 3 consecutive nights, that the IRGC's own commanders are still, according to signals, intelligence assessments shared with allied governments in the region, struggling to fully reconstruct in their post-operation damage reviews. The weapon they are trying to reconstruct the employment of does not have an official public designation in any American military press release. It does not appear in the Pentagon's publicly released operational summaries of Operation Epic Fury or its successor operational phases. It was not mentioned in the CENTCOM statements that described the May 7th counterstrike campaign against Bandar Abbas, Keshm Island, and the Shahed Rabari naval base at Sirik. The mainstream coverage that followed those strikes focused correctly on the U.S. carrier air wings, the F-35 stealth approach corridors, the EA-18G Growler electronic warfare blinding of Iranian radar networks, and the bunker-penetrating munitions that sealed the tunnel entrances of the underground missile cities. All of that was real. All of that happened. But none of that explains the specific category of damage that American Special Operations Forces achieved against the dispersed coastal launcher network that the IRGC had specifically designed to survive exactly the kind of precision air campaign that everyone watching this conflict was focused on. The operators who executed what is now being referred to in classified briefings, reviewed by intelligence professionals with access to the relevant compartments as Operation Tidal Wave, and in the broader special operations community by the informal designation that gives this script its title, the Tsunami, did not approach from the air. They did not announce their presence with the electronic signature of fighter jet radar or the thermal bloom of a bunker-penetrating warhead detonating against hardened reinforced concrete. They came from the water. They came in the specific way that United States naval special warfare operators have been trained to come for 5 decades of operational development that the public understands in broad outline and almost never understands in specific operational application. And what they did when they arrived at the sites that Iranian petroleum engineers, military architects, and IRGC logistics commanders had spent the better part of 2 decades building into the coastal geology of the Strait of Hormuz changed the specific strategic calculation that the conflict's resolution depends on in ways that no air campaign, however precise, however devastating, however comprehensively planned, could have achieved alone. This is the story of the Tsunami operation. Not the version that will appear in the eventual official history, which will sanitize the operational details that operational security still requires be protected. The version that the strategic analysis demands be understood now. Because the deal that was announced on Memorial Day weekend, the uranium transfer that the Supreme Leader's own order had declared, would never happen. And that is now scheduled to happen under IAEA verification. The 9 world leaders who said we are in simultaneously when Trump called them, all of it traces not just to the petroleum engineering physics of the naval blockade and the Helios-directed energy system closing the drone swarm option. It traces equally to what happened on those 3 nights along the Iranian coastline when operators who are not publicly named, using capabilities that are not publicly described, reached inside the most carefully concealed elements of the IRGC's Hormuz defense architecture and removed them from the strategic equation permanently. To understand what the Tsunami operation achieved and why it was necessary in a way that the air campaign alone could not address, you need to understand the specific problem that the IRGC's coastal launcher network was designed to solve and why solving that problem consumed more than 2 decades of engineering. Ingenuity, budgetary commitment, and operational discipline that the American intelligence community spent years documenting and longer still figuring out how to defeat. The fundamental strategic problem that the IRGC's naval doctrine was built around is the geography of the Strait of Hormuz itself. The strait is not open ocean. It is a choke point 21 miles wide at its narrowest navigable channel, flanked on both sides by coastline that Iran controls on the northern shore and that Oman manages on the southern shore under the specific security arrangements that make Oman the diplomatic intermediary that Pakistani channels work through, and that the American military works around in the operational planning that Oman's government officially does not acknowledge and practically does not impede. 21 miles. At that range, every category of anti-ship, Missile, in the IRGC's inventory, is not a long-range weapon requiring sophisticated over-the-horizon targeting. It is a point-blank weapon whose employment does not require the kind of radar infrastructure and targeting data chain that American electronic warfare assets are specifically designed to disrupt and destroy. The IRGC understood this geography with the precision that 20 years of operational planning applied to a single geographic problem produces. Their coastal defense network was not designed as a single integrated system that could be decapitated by destroying its command nodes, though the command nodes existed and the counterstrike campaign addressed them. It was designed as a distributed network of semi-autonomous launcher sites, each capable of independent operation, each capable of receiving a single targeting coordinate and executing an attack without continuous communication with a central command infrastructure. The intelligence architecture at CIRIC that the May 7th counterstrike addressed so comprehensively was the seeing eye of the network. But the network's hands, the actual launch platforms distributed across the coastal terrain, were designed to function without the eye once they had their targeting data. The dispersal architecture of these launcher sites is where the engineering investment of 20 years becomes visible in its full strategic sophistication. The IRGC did not build fixed launch facilities with reinforced concrete bunkers and distinctive radar signatures that satellite imagery could catalog and air planners could target. They built what petroleum engineering and military construction specialists who have reviewed the site assessments describe as environmental integration, a term that does not adequately convey what the satellite imagery, when properly interpreted with the ground truth data that special operations reconnaissance provided, actually shows. The launcher sites along the Iranian coast between Bandar Abbas and Jask, covering the full northern approaches to the strait, were not built into the landscape. They were built as the landscape, retaining walls that are launch ramps, fishing facility infrastructure that conceals missile storage chambers beneath floors rated for the weight of military vehicles, civilian maritime maintenance structures, whose internal dimensions, when measured against their external footprint, reveal the hollow spaces where Nor anti-ship missiles with their 300-kilogram warheads sit on mobile transporter erector launchers, waiting for the targeting coordinate that transforms a fishing facility into a weapon. The C-802 Nor missile, the primary weapon that these concealed launcher sites were built to employ, is not a weapon that American naval planners dismiss as a minor threat. It is a subsonic sea-skimming anti-ship missile with a 300-kilogram warhead that travels at low altitude to defeat radar detection, uses active radar terminal homing to acquire its target in the final approach phase, and has a range of approximately 120 kilometers from a coastal launcher positioned along the northern Hormuz shore. Against a vessel transiting the 21-mile navigable channel, a coastal launcher positioned on the Iranian shore does not need 120 kilometers of range. It needs the targeting data to acquire the vessel and the physical functionality to launch the missile. The IRGC had spent 20 years ensuring that the physical functionality to launch was distributed across enough concealed sites that no air campaign targeting fixed known infrastructure could address all of it before the first salvos were already in the air. This is the specific problem that the Tsunami operation was designed to solve. Not the command nodes, not the radar infrastructure, not the visible military facilities that the air campaign addressed with the systematic precision of a targeting database that had been building throughout the ceasefire period. The invisible network, the environmental integration, the fishing facilities and civilian maritime structures that held beneath their entirely plausible exterior functions the specific military hardware that the IRGC's dispersal doctrine had placed there precisely because placing it there made it unreachable by the weapons that had previously defined the limits of what military force could achieve against a prepared coastal defense. The reconnaissance that made the Tsunami operation possible began, according to intelligence community assessments, not in the weeks before the operation was executed, but in the months before Operation Epic Fury's opening phase. The collection architecture that the United States maintained in continuous coverage of the Iranian coastline includes the Sentinel-2 satellite imagery that documented the rusting vessels pressed into service as floating oil storage tanks when the blockade began filling Iran's land-based storage to capacity. But satellite imagery, however sophisticated, faces the same fundamental limitation against an adversary that has specifically designed its concealment architecture to defeat overhead observation. The environmental integration that the IRGC achieved at its dispersed launcher sites was not visible to overhead collection because it was designed not to be visible to overhead collection. Distinguishing a genuine fishing facility from a missile launcher site concealed within a fishing facility's structural envelope requires something that satellite imagery cannot provide alone. It requires ground truth, physical presence, the specific measurements and material assessments and thermal signatures and weight-bearing capacity analyses that only a human observer positioned within the facility can provide. The Naval Special Warfare Development Group, known within the Special Operations community by designations that shift with operational security requirements, has specific capabilities for coastal reconnaissance that the public record describes in outline, and operational reality reveals in the specific employment that the tsunami's execution required. Combat divers approaching from submarine launch platforms in the shallow waters of the Strait's northern approaches, operating in the specific conditions that the Persian Gulf's thermal layers and tidal patterns create, conducted the site assessments that converted satellite imagery analysis into actionable targeting intelligence. They measured, they documented, they carried collection devices whose specifications are not publicly disclosed, but whose output, the specific ground truth data that transform the analysis from a probable but by operational priority. The specific sites that assessment had determined were actively configured for employment, capable of launching within hours of receiving a targeting coordinate, as distinct from the sites that were in various stages of preparation, logistical support positioning, or maintenance cycles that temporarily reduced their operational readiness. The first night addressed the Tier 1 sites, the sites that intelligence assessment placed in the highest readiness category, the sites that the IRGC's own operational planning, as reconstructed from signals intelligence collection during the ceasefire period, had designated as the primary employment platforms for the opening salvo of any engagement with American naval forces transiting the Strait. The specific technical means by which the operators who reached those sites rendered them permanently non-functional is not publicly described in any official document. What the intelligence community assessments shared with allied governments confirm is the operational outcome: launcher infrastructure that cannot be repaired on a timeline relevant to the conflict's resolution, storage facilities that no longer contain the weapons they were built to protect, command and communication nodes at the site level that were addressed with the specific thoroughness that distinguishes a site rendered temporarily inoperable from a site rendered permanently inoperable. The distinction matters for the strategic assessment in a way that requires explicit statement. A site that is temporarily inoperable is a site that the IRGC can reconstitute when conditions permit, when the air campaign pressure reduces, when replacement hardware can be moved through logistics channels that have survived, when the operators and technicians who maintain and crew the launcher systems can return to their positions. A site that is permanently inoperable is a site that has been removed from the IRGC's strategic inventory with the same finality that a well that has been shut in without controlled depletion protocols has been removed from an oil field's production capacity. It cannot be restored to its previous function by will or investment or the passage of time. The second night addressed the Tier 2 sites, the sites that reconnaissance had assessed as capable of becoming operational within days to weeks of receiving replacement hardware and personnel, the sites that represented the IRGC's reconstitution capacity, the depth of the dispersal network that the doctrine's designers had built specifically to ensure that even if some percentage of the primary launcher sites were identified and addressed, the network as a whole retained enough distributed capacity to execute the salvo attack that the doctrine required. Depth is the word that every serious assessment of the IRGC's coastal defense architecture emphasizes. The network was not designed to survive the destruction of any particular site or any particular set of sites. It was designed to retain functional capacity after losing a significant percentage of its components, because the designers had correctly assessed that any realistic military engagement would involve the loss of some. The tsunami's second night addressed the depth. The Tier 2 reconstitution sites that represented the IRGC's ability to absorb first night losses and continue operating did not survive to perform that function. The operators who reached those sites applied the same approach, the same outcome-oriented methodology that the target packages specified, and that the operational commanders executing the mission understood would be evaluated not by the elegance of the means employed, but by the permanence of the result achieved. Operational elegance is a concept that belongs in the planning phase. Operational permanence is the concept that belongs in the assessment phase. The assessment of the second night's results, when it came back through the intelligence channels that track post-strike damage at the granular level that operational planning requires, confirmed the permanence that the planning had specified. The third night was different in character from the first two. Not because the targets it addressed were less important, they were in some respects the most strategically significant targets in the entire tsunami package, but because they required a different approach. The Tier 3 targets were not launcher sites. They were the logistics nodes and technical support infrastructure that the launcher network required to maintain operational continuity over time, the supply chains that moved replacement components from manufacturing and storage facilities in the Iranian interior to the coastal launcher sites, the technical specialist teams, and their equipment that the IRGC had positioned at specific locations along the coast to maintain the launcher hardware in operational condition, and the communication infrastructure that allowed the semi-autonomous launcher sites to receive the targeting data updates that their operational employment required, even without continuous connection to central command nodes. Logistics is the dimension of military capability that kinetic analysis consistently underweights, and that operational planning consistently, when executed by experienced practitioners who understand what they are doing, specifically prioritizes. The reason is elementary, and its implication is strategic. Destroying a launcher site removes a launcher. Destroying the logistics infrastructure that sustains a network of launcher sites removes not just the launchers that infrastructure currently supports, but the network's ability to reconstitute, to absorb losses, to replace expended hardware, and to maintain the operational readiness of the components that survive initial strikes. It changes the timeline of capability attrition from a timeline measured in individual site destruction to a timeline measured in network-wide operational collapse. When you destroy a logistics node that supports 15 launcher sites, you do not destroy 15 launcher sites. You remove the maintenance and resupply capability that keeps those 15 sites operational, which means that sites that were fully functional before the logistics node was destroyed will progressively degrade in operational readiness, as the hardware they depend on for continued function accumulates the wear, component failures, and calibration drift that all precision military equipment accumulates over time without maintenance access. The 15 sites become 15 progressively declining assets moving toward operational uselessness on a timeline that the logistics destruction has made irreversible. This is what the Tsunami's third night accomplished for the remaining elements of the IRGC's coastal launcher network that the first 2 nights had not addressed directly. The logistics infrastructure was the connective tissue. Removing it did not immediately silence every launcher that survived the first 2 nights. It set every surviving launcher on a clock, a maintenance and attrition clock whose endpoint is operational uselessness, that the IRGC's reconstitution capacity, already under the pressure of the oil revenue collapse the blockade had produced and the manufacturing degradation that American strikes on drone production facilities had achieved, cannot reset. The human dimension of the Tsunami operation is the dimension that the strategic analysis frameworks consistently omit, and that the narrative of what actually happened in those 3 nights requires be addressed directly, because what the operators who executed this operation encountered at the target sites was not the abstract infrastructure that targeting packages describe in coordinate grids and facility assessments. It was the specific human reality of an adversary's military organization, operating under wartime conditions in its home territory, defending infrastructure. It had spent careers building, staffed by individuals who were not strategic abstractions, but human beings, with the specific vulnerability to the kind of precise, close-range operational pressure that special operations forces are specifically trained and equipped to apply. The IRGC personnel at the Tier 1 launcher sites were not negligent in their security posture. They were operating under the security protocols that the IRGC's own doctrine had specified for the coastal defense network in wartime conditions, rotating guards, communication check schedules. Coastal launcher network, fast aircraft, precision munitions from outside visual range, standoff weapons whose employment required the attacker to remain outside the engagement envelope of the site's own defensive capabilities. What arrived was not any of those threat categories. What arrived was closer and quieter and more deliberate than any of the threat categories that the security protocols had been designed to address. The intelligence picture that emerged from the Tsunami's 3 nights, assembled through the post-operation collection that the assets maintaining continuous coverage of the Iranian coast provided, confirmed something that the pre-operation assessment had assessed as highly probable, but that the operational outcome converted from assessment to verified fact. The IRGC's coastal launcher network had been more extensive than even the most comprehensive pre-conflict intelligence estimates had determined. The environmental integration architecture, the degree to which launcher sites had been built into the civilian, maritime infrastructure of the coastal zone had achieved a concealment effectiveness that degraded the confidence levels on the pre-conflict targeting database in ways that the intelligence community's honest assessments acknowledged. The Tsunami's operations provided, through the ground truth reconnaissance that preceded the direct action components, a complete picture of the network's extent that overhead collection and signals intelligence had been unable to provide at the same confidence level. The picture it provided was more extensive than the pre-operation estimate, and the operations addressed a more comprehensive target set than the original planning had specified. Because the picture that reconnaissance revealed required the planning to expand to match the reality that reconnaissance had confirmed. That expansion, The adjustment from the pre-operation target set to the target set that reconnaissance confirmed needed to be addressed is the operational flexibility that the tsunami's execution demonstrated, and that the strategic analysis of what special operations forces actually contributed to this conflict's resolution needs to register explicitly. Air campaigns are planned against known targets. Special operations campaigns are planned against known targets and then adjusted in execution against the complete targets that the human collection that only special operations forces can provide reveals once operators are in the environment. The adjustment, the expansion. Specific problem being addressed requires exactly this capability, or whether it does not. Against the IRGC's coastal launcher network, with its environmental integration concealment architecture specifically designed to defeat overhead collection, it required exactly this capability, and the capability was applied with the completeness that the strategic requirement demanded. The IRGC's damage assessment of what the tsunami produced, as reconstructed from signals intelligence collection of communications between IRGC commanders in the days and weeks following the operation, reveals an institutional response that mirrors in miniature the broader institutional crisis that the blockade's economic physics and the Helios system's operational deployment produced at the organizational level. The initial communications attempted to characterize the losses as limited and recoverable. The assessment language shifted as the picture clarified. The shift from limited and recoverable to significant and requiring extended reconstitution to the assessment formulation that intelligence professionals who have reviewed the relevant collection describe as functionally equivalent to acknowledging that the coastal launcher network as it had existed before the tsunami no longer exists as an operational capability that can be reconstituted within any timeline relevant to the conflict's strategic evolution. That assessment formulation, the internal IRGC acknowledgement that the capability is gone rather than degraded, is the specific intelligence indicator that strategic analysis frameworks identify as the most significant signal of an institution approaching the threshold where continued military defiance ceases to be a viable option, and the diplomatic resolution that was previously rejected as unacceptable becomes the least bad of the remaining options. It is the institutional equivalent of the petroleum engineering assessment that storage tanks will reach exhaustion within 12 to 22 days, the specific technical endpoint that converts an abstract financial pressure into a concrete operational impossibility. The IRGC's internal assessment of what the tsunami produced converted the abstract proposition that the coastal launcher network might be too degraded to execute effective operations into the concrete operational conclusion that the network cannot execute the operations that the IRGC's Hormuz doctrine depends on. The doctrine that required the launcher network is a doctrine without its primary instrument. The connection between what the tsunami achieved operationally and what the Memorial Day weekend deal announcement represents strategically is not a connection that the official framing of the deal's announcement makes explicit. The official framing emphasizes the diplomatic track, the Omani intermediaries, the Pakistani channels, carrying the Memorandum of Understanding, the concurrent sequencing mechanism designed to prevent the JCPOA era stall, where relief preceded verification. The diplomatic framing is accurate in what it describes. It is incomplete in what it omits. The deal was not produced by the diplomatic track operating on its own momentum. The deal was produced by the convergence of multiple simultaneous pressures: the blockade's petroleum engineering physics, the Helios system's closure of the drone swarm option, the blockade's destruction of the proxy network's financial foundation, operating in the specific combination that removed the institutional options that made continued defiance viable. The tsunami was one of those simultaneous pressures, not the only one, not necessarily the decisive one in isolation from the others, but a pressure that addressed a specific capability that the other pressures did not address, and that the IRGC's strategic assessment required be addressed before the institutional calculation could reach the conclusion that the deal's announcement represents. The specific capability that the tsunami addressed, the dispersed coastal launcher network that represented the IRGC's ability to impose lethal costs on American naval forces transiting the strait even after the air campaign had addressed the visible military infrastructure, was the capability that the IRGC's hardline faction could point to as the remaining instrument of genuine military leverage. Everything else that the conflict had consumed, the Bandar Abbas command infrastructure, the Keshem Island underground missile cities, the Sirak early warning network, the drone manufacturing capacity that Helios had rendered strategically irrelevant, the proxy network's operational capacity that the financial collapse had defunded to the point of organizational dysfunction, could be characterized by The hardline faction has losses that still left Iran with the ability to make the strait genuinely dangerous for American vessels. That characterization was not entirely wrong before the tsunami. The dispersed launcher network represented real capability against that specific threat scenario. After the tsunami, the characterization was wrong in the specific way that matters most to the institutional calculation. It was operationally wrong. The capability it described no longer existed at the scale required to execute the threat it was supposed to represent. The hardline faction that ordered the May 7th attack on the 3 destroyers, the attack that completed the targeting database, provided the legal authorization for the counter-strike campaign, and produced 0 American casualties against the destruction of the most strategically significant fixed military infrastructure in the IRGC's Hormuz defense architecture, had based its strategic assessment on the belief that even if the air campaign addressed the visible military infrastructure, the dispersed launcher network would survive as the instrument that prevented American naval superiority from translating into the kind of overwhelming strategic pressure that would force an institutional decision. The assessment was not irrational given the intelligence the hardline faction had access to about the difficulty of addressing the environmental integration architecture through overhead collection and air campaign means alone. The assessment was wrong because it failed to account for what American Special Operations Forces were doing in the months before the conflict's kinetic phase opened and in the specific 3 nights of the tsunami's execution that converted the pre-operation reconnaissance into the operational reality that the post-operation damage assessment confirmed. The B-2 bombers that were running training missions from Whiteman Air Force Base to European airspace and back, replicating the flight profile of missions carrying GBU-57 bunker-penetrating munitions toward hardened underground facilities, are the visible strategic signal that the analytical community focuses on when assessing the IRGC's remaining options. The submarines, the Gadir-class and mini-submarines that remain deployed in the shallow waters of the strait and the approaches, the ballistic missile mobile launchers repositioning across dispersal routes that ISR assets are tracking with the continuous coverage that the operational picture demands, the residual kinetic options that remain in the IRGC's strategic inventory after the losses this conflict has imposed. These are real. They require real analysis and real defensive capability to address. The Dark Eagle deployment request, sitting unsigned on a desk in Washington, exists precisely because the ballistic missile option is real and requires the specific deterrent architecture that a hypersonic glide vehicle system traveling at Mach 17 can provide against mobile launchers that any other delivery system requires unacceptably long engagement timelines to address. But the analysis of what remains requires equal precision about what does not remain. The coastal launcher network that was the IRGC's specific answer to the question of how a power without conventional naval supremacy imposes lethal costs on the most capable naval force in human history operating in a constrained maritime geography does not remain. The environmental integration architecture that 20 years of engineering ingenuity and construction investment built into the coastal terrain of the northern Hormuz shore does not remain. The dispersal doctrine's reconstitution capacity, the depth that the architecture's designers specifically built into the network to absorb losses and continue operating, does not remain. What remains are the weapons categories that the IRGC's doctrine treated as supplementary to the coastal launcher network. The ballistic missiles, the submarines, the surviving fast attack boat inventory dispersed in dual-use ports. Real threats, serious threats, threats that require serious defensive capability to address, but threats that the IRGC's own internal assessment has reached the specific conclusion about that the strategic analysis requires be stated directly. They are the threats that remain after the primary instrument of the doctrine has been removed. They are the remaining hand, not the strong hand. The strong hand was the coastal launcher network. The tsunami removed it. The men who executed Operation Tidal Wave will not receive public recognition in the form that the scale of their operational achievement would warrant if military achievement in conventional kinetic operations were the metric being applied. Their names are protected by the operational security requirements that the continued sensitivity of the methods they employed, the relationships that enabled the maritime access they required, and the intelligence sources that the pre-operation reconnaissance produced make necessary for a period that extends well beyond the conflict's resolution. The community they belong to has a tradition of operating in exactly this manner, achieving strategic outcomes through means that the public record cannot fully describe, in conditions that the public narrative cannot fully acknowledge, against objectives whose significance the public analysis consistently underweights precisely because the contribution cannot be fully examined in the open. That tradition is not a limitation on the analysis. It is the operational function itself. The ability to achieve what could not be achieved through the visible means that the adversary had spent decades designing its concealment architecture to defeat depends on the invisibility that the tradition maintains. Revealing the method defeats the method. The method remains valuable precisely because it remains, in its specific details, unavailable to the adversary's future planning. What can be examined, what the strategic analysis requires be examined, is the outcome. The IRGC's coastal launcher network, the specific capability that represented the most credible remaining instrument of genuine military leverage after the air campaign had addressed the visible infrastructure, does not exist as an operational capability within the timeline, relevant to the conflict's strategic resolution. The deal announced on Memorial Day weekend, the uranium transfer now scheduled under IAEA verification, concurrent with the first tranche of sanctions easing, the Hormuz demining operation underway, with Avenger-class mine countermeasures ships and MH-60S helicopters and Mk-18 autonomous underwater vehicles, establishing the safe corridors that insurance underwriters need to certify before commercial transit resumes. All of it is happening in a strategic environment where the IRGC's ability to threaten the Strait with the specific distributed lethality that the coastal launcher network was designed to provide has been removed. That removal is not reflected in the official account of what produced the deal. It will not be reflected in the initial historical assessments. It will eventually be reflected in the comprehensive operational histories that the conflict's full documentation will produce. When the classification requirements that currently protect its details are eventually relaxed, and the picture that the operations participants carry in their knowledge of what actually happened can be assembled into the complete account that the strategic significance of the tsunami's outcome deserves. When that account is assembled, it will show that the deal announced on Memorial Day weekend was produced not by any single pressure, but by the specific convergence of pressures that addressed every dimension of the IRGC's remaining leverage simultaneously: the blockade's petroleum engineering physics, removing the financial foundation, the Helios system closing the drone swarm option, the proxy network's financial collapse defunding the axis of resistance, and the tsunami removing the coastal launcher network that represented the IRGC's last credible claim to the ability to make the Strait genuinely dangerous for American naval forces operating at the level of capability that the conflict had deployed. The resistance economy mythology that sustained 47 years of revolutionary defiance met something it was not designed to survive. Not the sanctions that left shadow fleet pathways, not the diplomatic pressure that the IRGC inner circle could filter from the decision authority. Not the air campaign alone, however comprehensive, however precisely executed, however devastating in its effect on the visible infrastructure that the targeting database had cataloged. It met the compound pressure of all of these, simultaneously operating in the specific convergence that the tsunami's contribution to closing the coastal launcher option made complete. Marines on decks, visible in the Gulf of Oman, turning shadow fleet evasion into seized assets. Lasers in the Strait, invisible to the drone operators whose screens simply went blank where assets had been. Operators in the dark, before dawn, on 3 consecutive nights along the Iranian coast, removing the hand that the IRGC had told itself it would still have when everything else was gone. The lights went out, the deal was announced, the uranium is leaving. And somewhere in the coastal terrain of the northern Hormuz shore, in the fishing facility infrastructure whose internal dimensions no longer match their external footprint in the specific way that the environmental integration architecture once made them operationally indistinguishable from what their exterior suggested they were, the 20-year investment in the weapon that was supposed to make the Strait too dangerous for the most lethal naval force in human history to transit without Iranian permission, has reached its operational endpoint. Not through the overhead collection that could not see it well enough, not through the air campaign that could not reach it completely. Through the specific means that the specific problem required. Quiet, precise, permanent. The tsunami did not make waves. It did not need to. The waves were already everywhere else. What the tsunami needed to do was reach what the waves could not reach, and it did. To end operations against third parties is the provision that the IRGC's hardline faction has most strongly resisted. The hardline faction's resistance is not irrational within its own institutional logic. The proxy network is not simply a military instrument for the IRGC's regional strategy. It is the institutional identity of the faction that built it. The commanders, who spent careers constructing the axis of resistance, extending Iranian influence through proxy organizations that gave the Islamic Republic reach beyond its borders into Lebanon and Yemen and Iraq and Syria, built their institutional position within the IRGC on the credibility and keep content up to cut point. Add tight closing paragraph closing. The compound pressure of 2026 addressed every dimension of remaining leverage simultaneously. The blockade severing the oil revenue that funded everything, the Helios system closing the drone swarm option, the air campaign dismantling the visible infrastructure, the proxy network defunding to organizational dysfunction, and the tsunami removing the coastal launcher network that represented the last credible claim to genuine military leverage in the Strait. Physics does not care about mythology. The resistance economy mythology sustained 47 years of revolutionary defiance against pressures that each, individually, the regime's opponents had assessed as decisive and that were not. The compound pressure of 2026 was different because it addressed every dimension simultaneously, closing every option with the specific technical means that each dimension required, leaving only the deal. The rusty ships pressed into service as floating oil storage tanks are the monument to what the blockade produced. The skilled tunnel entrances at Keshem Island are the monument to what the air campaign produced. The fishing facilities along the northern Hormuz shore, whose internal dimensions no longer match their exterior footprint, are the monument to what the tsunami produced. 3 monuments, 3 instruments, 1 convergence. The uranium is leaving Isfahan. The Hormuz lanes are being cleared. The deal was announced. And somewhere in the coastal terrain of the northern Hormuz shore, the 20-year to make the strait too dangerous for the most powerful naval force in human history to transit without Iranian permission has reached its endpoint. Not through the overhead collection that could not see it well enough, not through the air campaign that could not reach it completely, through the specific means that the specific problem required. Quiet, precise, permanent. The tsunami did not make waves. It did not need to. The waves were already everywhere else. What the tsunami needed to do was reach what the waves could not reach, and it did. Physics does not negotiate. The blockade does not distinguish between the resistance economy mythology and the petroleum geology of wells that cannot restart after improper shut-in procedures. The lights went out. The deal was announced. The uranium is leaving. And the operators who came from the water in the hours before dawn on those 3 consecutive nights along the Iranian coast, whose names will not appear in any public account, whose methods will not be that reached where the other hands could not reach, and what it removed cannot be restored, not by investment, not by engineering, not by the passage of time, not by the mythology of resistance that has been the Islamic Republic's institutional identity for 47 years. The sea closed over the debris without ceremony, without information, the way the Helios beam leaves nothing to examine, the way the deal leaves nothing to go back to. Physics does not care about mythology, and the quiet along the northern Hormuz shore in the hours before dawn on those 3 consecutive nights was the sound of a strategic calculation being permanently revised by the specific physical reality that had just been introduced into it. The revision is complete. The deal is the consequence. And the consequence is real in the way that only physical reality, not mythology, not doctrine, not 47 years of institutional defiance, can be real. The lights went out, the deal was made, the tsunami did its work. Closing, the compound pressure of 2026 addressed every dimension of remaining leverage simultaneously. The blockade severing the oil revenue that funded everything, the Helios system closing the drone swarm option, the air campaign dismantling the visible infrastructure, the proxy network defunding to organizational dysfunction, and the tsunami removing the coastal launcher network that represented the last credible claim to genuine military leverage in the strait. Physics does not care about mythology. The resistance economy mythology sustained 47 years of the compound pressure of 2026 was different because it addressed every dimension simultaneously, closing every option with the specific technical means that each dimension required, leaving only the deal. The rusty ships pressed into service as floating oil storage tanks are the monument to what the blockade produced. The sealed tunnel entrances at Keshem Island are the monument to what the air campaign produced. The fishing facilities along the northern Hormuz shore, whose internal dimensions no longer match their exterior footprint, are the monument to what the tsunami produced. 3 monuments, 3 instruments, 1 convergence. The uranium is leaving Isfahan, the Hormuz lanes are being cleared, the deal was announced, and to make the strait too dangerous for the most powerful naval force in human history to transit without Iranian permission has reached its endpoint, not through the overhead collection that could not see it well enough, not through the air campaign that could not reach it completely, through the specific means that the specific problem required, quiet, precise, permanent. The tsunami did not make waves. It did not need to. The waves were already everywhere else. What the tsunami needed to do was reach what the waves could not reach, and it did. Physics does not negotiate. The blockade does not distinguish between the resistance economy, mythology, and the petroleum geology of wells that cannot restart after improper shut-in procedures. The lights went out, the deal was announced, the uranium is leaving, and the operators who came from the water in the hours before dawn on those 3 consecutive nights along the Iranian coast, whose names will not appear in any public account, whose methods will not be described in any open-source document, whose contribution to the strategic convergence that produced the Memorial Day weekend announcement will not be recognized in the form that its strategic significance warrants, carried out the mission that the compound pressure required to be complete. The tsunami was the hand that reached where the other hands could not reach, and what it removed cannot be restored, not by investment, not by engineering, not by the passage of time, not by the mythology of resistance that has been the Islamic Republic's institutional identity for 47 years. The sea closed over the debris without ceremony, without information, the way the Helios beam leaves nothing to examine, the way the deal leaves nothing to go back to. Physics does not care about mythology. And the quiet along the northern Hormuz shore in the hours before dawn on those 3 consecutive nights was the sound of a strategic calculation being permanently revised by the specific physical reality that had just been introduced into it. The revision is complete. The deal is the consequence. And the consequence is real in the way that only physical reality, not mythology, not doctrine, not 47 years of institutional defiance, can be real. The lights went out, the deal was made, the tsunami did its work.